Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Ayin Dalid focuses primarily on how you define a mavoi. What's a mavoi? We will see a number of opinions of Amoraim on the subject, and the Gemara will bring some other cases which may shed light on the topic. As an aside, we'll get into the subject of do you make a gzeira that if you're allowed to carry from point A to point B, but not from point A to point C, that we don't allow you to count from point A to B either, lest you end up carrying to point C. So, first of all, the Gemara wants to know, how do you define a mavoi? Now, it's important to know how you define a mavoi because it has certain halachas. As we've seen in the beginning of the Masechta, it requires a lechi or a kaira, a side beam or a cross beam, to make it permitted to carry within it. That's assuming that you have a shitufei mavais if necessary. As opposed to a chatzar, if you'll define it as a chatzar, then it would need something different. It would need a pas arba, as we've seen earlier in the Masechta as well. So we have to know what's a mavoi. Now, we've seen this discussion brought up earlier, but here the Gemara brings it in full, and it's a three-way machlokes early Amoraim how you define a mavoi. According to Rav, it has to be a mavoi which requires a shituf. Any situation that doesn't require a shitufei mavos doesn't count as a mavoi. So therefore, you need a minimum of 2 chatzeros, each chatzer containing 2 houses. That will be a total of 4 houses, opening 2 each into a chatzer, and 2 chatzeros opening into the mavoi. That's Rav's way of defining a mavoi. Less than that is not a mavoi. According to Shmuel, it's enough if you have 1 house opening into 1 chatzer, and besides for that, you just have 1 other house. Okay, so everybody agrees you have to have at least 1 house opening into a chatzer, opening into the mavoi. Besides for that, Shmuel says you just have to have a house, even if that house opens directly into the mavoi. You have to have at least 2 houses in the mavoi, but one of them doesn't have to have a chatzer, and you don't need more than that. And Rabbi Yochanan says, besides for your house opening into the chatzer and the chatzer into the mavoi, besides that, you don't even have to have any other residence. You could just have an uninhabited chorva, a house where nobody lives and is not really suitable. It's somewhat suitable. It has walls and a roof, but it's not really in habitable condition. So Gemara has 2 comments on Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. First of all, Gemara says that Abaye asked Rav Yosef, what would Rabbi Yochanan say if there was just a shvil akromim, a path through the vineyards that opened into this mavoi? Meaning, besides for the house and the chutzner, other than that, you didn't have a chorva. You just had a place that people could walk. So Rabbi Yosef said no. Rabbi Yochanan would not say that that counts as a mavoi. You have to have 2 places that are suitable for living to some extent. So besides for your house and chutzner, which everybody agrees you also have to have at least a chorva. At least a ruined house, not anything less than that. Now the Gemara comments that Rav Yochanan here seems to fit with another opinion stated by Rav Yochanan elsewhere. And that is the following issue. The Gemara is bothered by, why don't we make a gzeira that you're going to end up carrying objects from the chatzar into the chorva? Meaning, Rav Yochanan says it's considered a mavoi, and you can matter it, you can be permitted to carry within the mavoi with a lechi and a kaira, a crossbeam and a side beam. Now it seemed to indicate that I'm allowed to carry my objects from my chatzar. Remember, he said that there's a house opening to a chatzar, from my chatzar into the mavoi. Now, it would be forbidden to carry into the chorva across the street, because we didn't make a sheet of mavois here. And that house is a separate house. We don't have an eruv with that house. I'm allowed to carry into the mavoi because there is no partnership in the mavoi. Nobody else uses or lives in the mavoi. That house is empty, and it's not enough of a house to be considered a rishus to require a sheet of mavoi. So I'm allowed to carry from my chatzar into the mavoi. I'm not allowed to carry into the chorva though. That's a different rishus. So why doesn't Rav Yochanan make a gzeira? If I allow you to carry from the chatzar into the mavoi, you'll also carry into the chorva. So the Gemara says that this actually is dependent on a whole nother machlokes, and Rav Yochanan's opinion there matches with the fact that he doesn't make this gzeira here. What's that machlokes? That machlokes is about a situation where you're allowed to carry within a chatzar, or from one chatzar to another chatzar. Do I say there's a gzeira you may carry from your house into the chatzar? just like Rav Yechanan is not afraid of that gzeira. He doesn't make a gzeira that you can't carry from your house into the chutzner, lest you end up carrying from the chutzner to another chutzner, or from the chutzner to a mavoi. So here too, one step further along, he wouldn't say that there's a gzeira you can't carry from your chutzner into the mavoi, gzeira you may come to carry into the churva. He doesn't say that. Now, what's this all about? What's the case of all these gzeiras? So it's in the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. There is a machlokes tanaim where we require an erev chatzeres and a shetufim mavais at all. According to Rabbi Shimon, the only issue is if you're planning on carrying from your house into somebody else's chatzer. If you're not planning on carrying from your house into somebody else's chatzer, you just want to carry from chatzer to chatzer, or from chatzer to mavoi, you don't need any erev. There's no requirement for erev. All the rishus are considered to be one. It's one big rishus. Chatzers are considered to be one. Mavois are considered to be one. You're allowed to carry from any rishus yachad to another rishus yachad without any erev. The only problem is carrying from your house into a jointly owned chutzner or somebody else's chutzner. That's what looks like you're going from a rishus hayachad to a rishus harabim. Going from chutzner to chutzner is not an issue. Now, is the halacha like Reb Shimon or not? So the Gemara quotes 3 statements of Amoraim on the subject. Rav says the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon only if there is no erev chatzeres. That's important, because if there would be an erev chatzeres, I would be allowed to carry from my house into my chutzner. There's an erev chatzeres on that chutzner, and therefore there's a gzeira. If I can carry from my house to the chutzner, I might come to carry from my house to somebody else's chutzner, which Rabbi Shimon agrees is forbidden. Rabbi Shimon only says you don't need an erev chatzeres to go from chutzner to chutzner. To go from house to someone else's chutzner, you do need. And therefore, says Rav, if there's an erev chatzeres, I'm allowed to carry from my house to my chutzner, the gzeira I might carry it further to the next chutzner. Shmuel and Rav Yechanan disagree. Shmuel and Rav Yechanan say no, you don't have to. That the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon, even in a situation where there is an erev chatzeres and it's permitted to carry from my house into my own chutzner because everybody else joined in an erev in that chutzner, all the other residents of that chutzner. I don't make gzeira that if I allow you to do that, you can end up carrying further to somebody else's chutzner, even objects that began Shabbos in my house. There is no concern for that. So now, the Gemara's point is, Rav Yechanan says that that's not a concern, that you're going to carry an object from your house out of your chutzner into the mavoi or somebody else's chutzner. So he says no gzeira that if you're allowed to carry from point A to point B, you may carry further to point C. So here too we should say the same thing, and he does say the same thing, and it fits with his shita that he says that when you have a mavoi that has a house and chutzner on one side and a chorv on the other side, you're allowed to carry from point A to point B. You're allowed to carry from the house. You're allowed to carry from the chutzner, that should be, not from the house. You're allowed to carry from the chutzner into the mavoi, that's point A to point B. There's no gzeira that you may carry it further into the chorva, which would be point C. That's not an issue. Okay, the Gemara now questions Shmuel's opinion and shows that he may have changed his mind. The Gemara wants to know whether he changed his mind or not. This is referring to Shmuel's opinion as to how we define a mavoi. Again, Shmuel had said that a mavoi is anything, any structure, any mavoi that has opening into it at least one house and a chutzner, and one other house straight into the mavoi. You don't have to have 2 houses, and you don't have to have 2 houses each for 2 chatzeres. So Gemara says that Rav Bruna said over this sugya, and Rav Elazar Bar Beirav asked him, did Shmuel really say that? He said, yes. He said, well, show me where Shmuel is staying, because I'd like to ask him about it. So he showed him, and he went and he asked him. He said, Shmuel, did you really say this? He said, yes. He said, how could you say that? How could you say that you don't have to have 2 houses in 2 chatzeres each, like Rav? You once told us that in Hilchas Eruvin we always are medayik very carefully. We're very specific and particular about the language of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah says clearly that a mavoi is to a chutzner what a chutzner is to a house. So just like a chutzner has to have 2 houses in it, a mavoi has to have 2 chatzeres in it. Not one chutzner. It says chatzeros. It says hamavi lechatzeros kechatzer labatim. A mavoi is 2 chatzers. Obviously, a mavoi has to have multiple chatzeros in it. How can you say that it's enough if it has only one chatzar? So Mr. Shmuel was quiet. So, the Gemara asks, does that mean that Shmuel changed his mind or not? So Mr. says, I can prove to you that he didn't, because there was a Jew by the name of Avos Bar Ihi who lived in a chatzar which opened into a mavoi by himself. There was no other, or there weren't 4 houses and 2 chatzeres there, that for sure not. And Shmuel allowed him to put up a lechi or a kaira in the mavoi and carry in the mavoi. So you see, he defined it as a mavoi, and not only that, but it stayed that way until Shmuel died, and when Rav Anan became head of the area after him, Rav Anan took it down, and he said it's no good. And Avos complained. He said, Shmuel allowed it. Why are you giving us a hard time? So you see that all the way to the end of his life, Shmuel allowed this arrangement, and he held that you don't have to have 4 houses and 2 chatzeres. So Gemara says not necessarily. It could be that what happened actually was that there was one house that was halachically questionable, and it changed, and that's why Rav Anan took it down. What was that? So Gemara says there were 3 houses, and the 4th house was a shul, and nobody lives in the shul, but the shamash of the shul slept there. He didn't eat there, but he slept there. And Shmuel had paskined that you follow where you sleep, and therefore the place that he sleeps is considered his residence, and the shul is his residence, and there are 4 houses. And therefore, even though Shmuel had changed, really, to hold like Rav, and he says that he actually now had changed his mind and holds that you do need to have 4 houses and 2 chatzeros in order to define the area as a mavoi. So this was fine because the shul counted as a house because the shamash lived and slept in the shul. Now Rav Avos didn't realize that. He thought that Shmuel holds that it goes by where you eat, and therefore it doesn't count as a shul. The shul doesn't count as a house. The only reason Shmuel was allowing it is because he didn't hold like Rav. Then, after Shmuel passed away, what happened is that the shamash stopped sleeping in the shul. Then it became not a house l'chol hadayos. So according to Avos, he thought, well, Shmuel would still hold that it's permitted because Shmuel never considered it a house in the first place. The only reason he allowed us is because he doesn't hold like Rav, and he says you don't have to have 4 houses. But Rav Anan came and he took down the lech, and he said, no, this is no longer, Shmuel really held like Rav. He changed to hold like Rav, and this is no longer a qualified mavoi because it no longer has 4 houses because the shamash stopped sleeping in the shul. Okay, now the Gemara brings a case, an halacha of Rav, which may be related to this halacha we've seen so far, and the Gemara will question whether or not it's related. The case is as follows. You have a Jew and an idol worshiper sharing a mavoi. They each have a house which opens into a chatzar, which opens into the mavoi. The thing is, the Jew has 2 other houses, or 1 other house, attached to his house, attached row houses. Those houses don't open into this chatzar. They have a window that they share with this Jew's house. They themselves only open into Rishus Harabim. And the question is this Jew allowed to make an Erev Chatzeris with those other 2 neighbors of his attached houses? So Gemara says that Rav said no. And he said they're not allowed to. And Abaye asked Rabbi Yosef, why not? Abaye thought that the reason must be because this mavoi that the Jew and the guy are sharing is not a good enough mavoi. It doesn't have 2 houses, and it doesn't have 2 chatzeros. It has 2 chatzeros, but the chatzar of the guy, of the idol worshiper, doesn't count. And therefore it doesn't have the minimum number, it doesn't count as a mavoi. And if you allow the Jews to make an Erev Chatzeris between them, then they can end up carrying in the mavoi. We don't want that to happen. So Rabbi Yosef said that's not the reason, and the same halacha would apply even if there wasn't a mavoi between the Jew and the idol worshiper, even if they were both shared houses in a chutzner. There were 2 houses in a chutzner, and the Jew had 2 neighbors attached to his house. They're allowed to do an Erev Chatzeris. They would not be allowed to do an Erev Chatzeris. Rav would say that you should not do that. Now, what's the reason? So Rav's reason is because, as we know, we don't want Jews to live together in a chutzner with an idol worshiper, so they shouldn't learn from their actions. In order to prevent this Jew from living there, so we don't allow other people to make an Erev Chatzeris with him. That way it'll be more difficult for him. They won't be joined together with him. He'll be alone, and that'll encourage him to move out. That's Rav's reasoning. Now, the Gemara asks, according to Shmuel's understanding, that the problem was that there aren't enough houses and chatzeris in the mavoi, and his understanding that Rav is only saying this halacha where there's a mavoi between the Jew and the guy, not if there's a chatzer. So the Gemara wants to know, why would Rav say the same halacha twice? He already told us that you have to have 2 houses in 2 chatzeros each in order to be able to carry within a mavoi. So Shmuel answers. So Abaye answers, I thought Rav said this halacha twice to teach us two things. First of all, in this case, he needs to teach me that the house of the idol worshiper doesn't count as a house as far as the minimum calculation of houses. And if he hadn't taught me this halacha, if he would have only said this case and not his previous halacha, I wouldn't know exactly how many houses and how many chatzeros. Here you just have, it just mentions one house of an idol worshiper and one house of a Jew plus 2 neighbors of the Jew. I would know you need more than that. I wouldn't know how many. So therefore Rav has to say both halachas. Bottom line, the Gemara says Rav has nothing to do with that. Rav was coming to teach me that we want to discourage a Jew from living in a mavoi or chatzar together with an idol worshiper. The Gemara says, now I understand why, when this halacha was said over by Ravi Tavla, he said Ovid Kechavim twice. He said idol worshiper. There's 2 halachas we are learning here. The case of a mavoi and the case of a chatzar, which is shared by the Jew and the idol worshipper, and therefore we have to repeat this twice. That's why Rabbi Tavla said Ovid Kechavim twice.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.